Slavery, right? Okay, but we've got to learn the law as it is.
Is that not like money?
Laws of slavery.
Okay. This is on now. That. Slavery, right? Okay. Let's mute. Sorry, guys. You know, I used to be much more proficient with this because I use it much less often now. Zoom. I think this is the only, and because I've missed a few weeks, this is the only thing I'm regularly using Zoom for nowadays. I used to be using Zoom 3 or 4 times a day. Anyways, okay, I'm going to mute everyone. And then I'm going to share the screen. Takes a minute longer, but I kind of can still find everything. Okay, here we go. I'm going to turn my head slightly because I'm going to be looking at the other screen to read. Here we go. So Avadim, chapter 1, the laws of, as we'll see, the Jewish slave. So this particular section contains within it 13 mitzvot, 5 of which are positive mitzvot, and 8 are negative mitzvot. So here they go. 1, the law governing the acquisition of a Hebrew servant, Jewish servant, right? Number 2, not to sell him in the manner that servants are usually sold. Number 3, not to make him perform excruciating labor, and we'll define exactly what that means. Not to make him perform servile tasks, and also we'll explain the context of that. Number 5, not to allow a resident alien to make him perform excruciating labor. The Hebrew term for resident alien is ger toshav. Ger toshav was a non-Jewish person who lives within Israel in the Jewish community and takes on certain commitments, primarily the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, and therefore they're allowed residency. But they're expected to live within the certain framework of halakha. Halacha 6, to grant a Hebrew servant a severance gift when he attains his freedom. And number 7, which is the flip side of that mitzvah, not to let him go free, empty-handed. There must be some type of severance payment. Number 8, to redeem a Hebrew maidservant. Number 9, to designate her as a wife. Number 10, not to sell her a second time. Number 11, to have a Canaanite servant work forever, unless his master causes one of his primary limbs to fall. Because as we'll learn, for a Jewish slave, we know there's a limitation on how long one can serve. But for a non-Jewish slave, that they would remain forever, unless, as we said, he caused some type of injury to one of their primary limbs. Then a slave would go free. Number 12, not to return to his master, a servant who fled from the diaspora to Eretz Israel. And number 13, not to oppress this servant who has fled to us. So these are 13 mitzvot, as we learned. 5 of them are positive mitzvahs, 8 are negative mitzvahs, and we'll unpack each of these mitzvahs in the forthcoming chapters. So today's halakha, some of the basics. The term Hebrew servant or Eved Ivri, used by the Torah, refers to a Jew whom the court sells by compulsion or a person who sells himself willingly. And we'll learn when exactly the court can do that or when an individual can do that. What's implied? When a person steals and does not have the resources to repay the principal, and this is important because we know about Geneva, we've been learning about Geneva, that you would pay not just the principal, but you would also be paying a fine. So when the person can't afford to repay the principal, then the court sells him, as we've already explained in Hilchot Geneva. And no other Jewish person is sold by the court except a thief. Now, there's no other time that a court would, even if I owe money on a loan or something like that, court doesn't sell me. It's only for thievery. Concerning such a thief sold by the courts, the pasuk says, when you acquire a Hebrew servant, and similarly we have a repetition of the similar laws where it says when your Jewish brother will be sold to you. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody that the court sells to, something that the court sells. Something that the court sells, an individual that the court sells because of thievery. Okay, so that's how we know a court can sell somebody. To what does the term a person who sells himself refer? How does it come about that a person would sell himself? When a Jew becomes sorely impoverished. The Torah gives them permission to sell himself as a servant. As the Pasuk says, when your brother will become impoverished and be sold to you. That's an individual selling themselves because they are so destitute. The person is not allowed to sell himself as a servant and stash away the money. Use it to buy merchandise or utensils or give it to his creditor. Okay, so you can't sell yourself to pay off a loan. He may sell himself only when he needs the money for his very livelihood. He literally can't live. A person is not permitted to sell himself unless he has no property remaining at all, meaning even his clothing no longer remains. So you're talking about such a level of deep desperation and poverty. In such a situation, only in such a situation, may a person sell himself. So that's the two ways that a Jew can be sold as a slave to another Jew. Either by the courts, when he can't afford the principal on something that he had stolen, or he's reached such a level of poverty that he literally has nothing. Halacha 2, we have already explained that a woman is never sold because of a theft. Similarly, she may not sell herself as a servant, nor may she purchase a Hebrew servant or a Canaanite servant because of the suspicion of immoral behavior. Okay, which makes sense. We don't want anyone to think that she's buying a slave for ulterior motives. A convert may not sell himself as a servant, and this is derived from the pasuk that says, and he shall return to his family. Because the Torah says, right, when the slave goes free after 7 years, he has to go back to his family. Meaning, it's speaking about someone who has family within the Jewish faith to go back to. Someone who converts to Judaism will not have family to go back to, and therefore cannot sell themselves. Halach 3, a Hebrew servant who is sold by the court is sold only to a native-born Israelite or to a convert to Judaism. Now, there's only to another Jew, born or converted. Similarly, a person who sells himself as a servant is not permitted to sell himself to a Gentile, not even to a resident alien. If he transgresses and sells himself even to a Gentile, even to the service of a false divinity itself, meaning, let's say he sold himself to a church, right? Still, then, if he did it, he's transgressed, but the sale is binding. As the verse says, which speaks of a person selling himself to what must be uprooted from a sojourner's family. What must be uprooted refers to a false divinity, meaning he can be selling, although he should not be selling himself to a non-Jew, but even if he went so far as selling himself to a false divinity, that sale is binding. Now, if a person says, I'm going to sell myself to a Gentile, he says, I'm so desperate, you buy me, or I'm going to go sell myself to the non-Jewish neighbor. One is not obligated to do anything for him until he actually sells himself. Once he sells himself to a Gentile, although he transgresses and acted improperly, it is a mitzvah to redeem him, so that he does not assimilate among them. As the pasuk says, after he is sold, redemption shall be granted him. So the sale is a sale, he will be a slave to this non-Jew, but now the community has an obligation to redeem such a person. Halacha 5. Neither a person who sells himself nor one who is sold by the court should be sold in public or on an auction block. Okay, this is the mitzvah that we mentioned, not to be sold like other slaves are sold, nor in an alley or as slaves are sold. As slaves are sold. As the pasuk says, he shall not be sold as a slave is sold. Instead, he should be sold in a private and honorable manner. So in those desperate situations where it becomes necessary to sell him, we've got to find at least the most dignified way of doing it. Halacha 6, it's forbidden to make any Hebrew servant perform excruciating labor. This is what we call avodat parech. You'll remember that we have this phrase about how the Egyptians treated us, and perhaps this is the basis of it. But what exactly does parech mean? What does excruciating labor mean? So you'll see it's not really backbreaking labor per se, but it refers to labor that has no limits or labor that is unnecessary and is asked of the servant with the intent to give him work so they will not remain idle. Okay, so he's going to give some examples of this. Based on the Rambam, sages said that a master should not tell his Jewish servant, "Ho under the vines until I come." So he gives him a job and says, "You keep doing this until I come." Why is that not okay? For he has not placed a limit on the work asked of him. Instead, he should tell him, "Ho until this and this time," or "until you reach this and this place." Because to leave someone doing a job indefinitely, this is what we talk about when we say parech, excruciating labor. I don't know when I'm going to be done. You just keep doing. You just keep doing until I come back. That we don't do. Similarly, you should not tell him dig in this place if he has no need for that activity. Right? So if you're planting trees, you're going to ask him to dig because you're going to plant trees. But if you're not, and you just ask him to dig just because you want to keep him busy, and there's no need for that particular activity, You can't do that. And he emphasizes, he says, even telling him to warm a drink for him or to cool one off for him is not okay. Even if he does not need it, such a thing is forbidden. Now, the point is, when we say avodas parach, although translated as excruciating labor, it's not about the physical effort that's required. Because even if it's simply just warming up a cup of tea for you, if you don't need to drink it, there's no need for it, you can't do that. It's about avodas parach. Then his definition is work without limit or work that is unnecessary. Okay, and we understand because that's undignified, right? And so it says it is forbidden and reflects the violation of the negative commandment, which the pasuk says, "Do not impose excruciating work on him." Thus, the Hebrew servant may be compelled to perform only a limited and necessary task. So there has to be a clear limit. Do this until this time, or do this until you've reached this point, and it must be something that the master needs that work done. Similarly, if a Hebrew servant is sold to a Gentile who imposes excruciating labor upon him, the Jews are commanded to prevent him from doing so. Obviously, ideally, you want to redeem him. But so long as you're not redeemed, you should ensure that he's not subjected to that type of labor. If they allow him to continue, then they transgress the negative commandment. As it says, you should not impose excruciating work upon him before your eyes. We are not ever required to enter into the Gentile's domain and check to see that he is not imposing excruciating labor upon him. This is implied by the term before your eyes, meaning when you see it, you are obligated to stop it. I guess if you can't, you can't. I'm not sure what happens if your non-Jewish neighbor is actually going to listen to you. If you say, you can use your slave, do this with him, I don't do that with him. I'm not sure how you're going to impose that, but I guess we're talking about where you do have some type of influence and you can do that. Halacha 7. Whenever a Jew purchases a Hebrew servant, he may not make him perform debasing tasks that are relegated only for servants. Okay? So besides for limitless work, and besides for unnecessary work, also those tasks, which are generally considered the lowest type of task, which only slaves do, you shouldn't have your Jewish servant do. Why? What is examples? To have him carry his clothes to the bathhouse, so remove his shoes. And we don't do this because the pasuk says, do not have him perform servile tasks. Instead, one should treat him as a hired laborer. As the pasuk says, he shall be like a hired laborer or as a resident among you. Now, we go further than that. It is, however, permitted to have the servant cut the master's hair, launder his clothes, and bake his dough. He may not ever make him manager of a public bathhouse, a public barber, or a public baker. Okay? If, however, this was his profession before he was sold, it is permitted. Indeed, at the outset, he should not teach him any profession at all, meaning don't give him new types of work. Instead, he should work at the profession at which he worked previously. That's the type of work you should give him as a hired laborer. When does the bab apply? Because when are you not allowed to subject someone to servile labor? That's to a Hebrew servant. That means if you own the person, you bought him from the basin or he sold himself to you. Why? Because such a person, his self-image is already depressed because he's been sold. And therefore, you don't want to further degrade him by using him for those menial tasks. Whenever a Jew has not been sold, he may be hired to perform servile tasks. If you can put out a job ad out there and say, I'm looking for someone to carry my clothes to the bathhouse in front of me. If somebody voluntarily takes that job, you can pay them for that job and they can do that job. If he's performing this work out of his own design, his own consent, and of course he can choose to leave whenever he wants. The difference by the servant is, or a slave is, well, firstly, he's already degraded because he had to sell himself, and secondly, he doesn't have the option to reject it. So therefore, there's an obligation on the owners on the master not to subject him to that type of menial servile labor. When people do not conduct themselves in an appropriate manner, it is permissible to impose one's authority over them by force and subjugate them. This is an interesting halacha. So he gives the example. When a king decrees that anyone does not pay the fixed head tax, such a person should be enslaved to the person who pays the head tax for him. Then a person who pays the head tax for someone may use that person for labor beyond the ordinary measure. So he has a special law, right? We spoke about a slave becoming a slave, either being sold by the Beis Din for robbery or sold themselves because they're completely destitute. Now what we're saying is that a king could impose a certain law where he says if somebody doesn't act appropriately, i.e. they don't pay the head tax, then somebody else who can pay on their behalf and take them as a slave, if that's how the person came into slavery, there's a bit more leeway of what you're allowed to expect from such a person. So he says that person can go for labor beyond the ordinary measure. He may not, however, use him as a Canaanite slave. Now, it's not the most degrading, lowest type of menial work, but you could certainly impose more work than you would to a higher laborer, which is the normal way you treat your Jewish slave. If that person does not conduct himself properly, you may use him as a slave. So he's saying it can go even a further level. Halacha 9. I guess the point of it is because the guys, I don't really know, but the way I understand it, I guess, is that what he's saying is this person is bringing about his own degradation. So therefore, he then can be used for those type of activities that otherwise you wouldn't do. You don't want to. The point is, you don't impose further degradation on a person. But if a person is choosing that, if we can call it choosing, then you can utilize their service to that degree as well. Halacha 9. A master. Now here we're going to see. Sorry, I jumped the gun earlier when I said we'll learn a little bit more about the slave. So we learned about the limitations of what type of work you can impose on your Jewish slave. Now we're going to talk about the general conditions of servitude or employment. A master is obligated to treat any Hebrew servant or maidservant as his equal with regard to food, drink, clothing, and living quarters. Okay, very interesting this. As implied by the pasuk, for it is good for him with you. You're going to make sure it's good for him with you, meaning at the same level as you. The master should not eat bread made of fine flour while his servant eats bread from coarse flour. The master should not drink wine while his servant drinks fresh wine. The master should not sleep on the cushions while his servant sleeps on straw. Nor should the master live in a walled city while the servant lives in a village. Or the master lives in a village while the servant lives in a walled city, because both those environments have different advantages. The servant, the slave, should be in the same type of environment. As implied also by the pasuk which we quoted, and he shall leave you. Meaning when the servant does go free, he's leaving you, meaning he's going from the same situation that you were in. On this basis, our sages said, and this is a famous quote, that anyone who buys a Hebrew servant actually buys a master for himself, right? Because you're obligated to take care of them like you take care of yourself, and there's limits on what exactly you can expect from them as far as their labor. Now, interesting though, so there's a balance to this, right? Because we're talking about the responsibility of the master, of the owner, of the slave. He's got to treat him like himself. A master must treat his servant brother in love, as implied in Leviticus, and with regard to your brothers, the children of Israel. And that's it. So now there's not only shouldn't you be imposing unnecessary, limitless labor, servile activity, and you've got to make sure that all his living conditions are comparable to yours, and you've got to treat him like a brother. Nevertheless, the servant himself must conduct himself as a servant with regard to those tasks he must perform. In the work that he does do, the servant has to remember, you know what? I'm not your brother. I mean, you are your brother as a Jew, but at the end of the day, the servant also has to have that humility to serve as required. And final halacha for today, halacha 10, the institution of a Hebrew maidservant and that of a Hebrew servant is not practiced except in the time when the Jubilee year is observed, meaning the times of the Beis HaMikdash and so on, where there's a king and you have the Yovel. This applies both to a Hebrew servant who sells himself and to one who is sold by the courts. We've already explained when the observance of the Jewish year was nullified. So practically speaking, we do not have slaves nowadays, and these laws are not relevant. Let's go to our questions. True or false? A convert may not be sold as a servant. Jeff, true. Okay? Because of the verse that says he must return to his family, and a convert wouldn't have a Jewish family. May a person sell himself to pay off a debt?
Yes.
So a person cannot sell themselves to pay off a debt, right? Only if they completely destitute. That's what we said. You can't sell yourself and pay your, right? Is there a mitzvah to redeem someone who willingly sold himself as a servant to a non-Jew? So he went ahead and sold himself to a non-Jew. He shouldn't have done that. He's transgressed.
Yeah.
Yes, there's still a mitzvah to redeem such a person.
Yeah.
And final question, which of the following statements is correct? A woman may not sell herself as a servant, but she may be sold by the courts. The courts do not sell women as servants, but she may sell herself. Women may never be sold as servants under any conditions. Which one is correct?
I think number one.
Number one.
Okay, number 3, a woman may never be sold. She can't sell herself, and the courts can't sell it. And okay, and that's about it's a kind of intimates that's about.
But you have a maidservant. What do you mean may never be sold? You have maidservant.
We'll learn about how a woman becomes a maidservant, and we'll learn also then that she's not treated as a servant. We'll see she must be married.
Oh, I see. Not sold.
But in other words, those conditions that we spoke about, like for stealing, or if someone finds themselves in a situation where they're destitute, where you would have a male being sold or selling themselves, a woman can't do that. Okay.
Hey,
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good to be back. Sorry, I missed last week, and have a beautiful week going forward.